you can switch to Arabic and French translations by clicking on the channels below at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and we will try to answer as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end. We're going to start off with a short introductory video message from our acting director, and then we will move to our 4 panelists for their presentation, after which we will have the Q&A sessions. So please save your questions till the end. Can we please start with the video?
From Ethiopia to Ukraine to China, the scale of these very different crises means we need to think about new models for actions on human rights. Ignoring human rights violations carries a heavy cost. We shouldn't underestimate the ripple effects. In a world where power is shifting, there's opportunity for new voices and coalitions to be heard.
In Tuvalu, we are living the realities of climate change, sea level.
Small Pacific Island states are demanding more from polluting countries. In the Americas, Colombia, Argentina, and Mexico took the remarkable step of expanding abortion rights. Meanwhile, in the US, they were restricted.
We won't go back! We won't go back!
After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the International Criminal Court and the UN quickly launched investigations into war crimes and other human rights violations. Russia was suspended from the UN Human Rights Council, and a coalition of governments imposed strict sanctions to hamper Russia's ability to fund its war. In Iran, people demanded change from a government that has denied them their rights and mismanaged the economy. These voices are powerful, but need the support of governments and institutions to hold those responsible to account. In our ever more disrupted world, we need to work together to create change. All governments not only have the opportunity, but an obligation to take action to protect human rights.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Lama Faqih. Lama is the Middle East and North Africa Director at Human Rights Watch, and she will be giving a regional overview of human rights conditions with 10 trends to watch out for from the past year. Please, Lama, go ahead.
Thank you, Hannah. Human rights are trending negatively across the Middle East and North Africa region, with shrinking space for civil society and free speech. The legacy of conflicts for which there has been rampant impunity for war crimes, and the entrenchment of authoritarian leaders, many of whom have strong bilateral relationships with Western powers, who are deprioritizing human rights in furtherance of security, economic, and other national priorities. Following the war in Ukraine, European countries in particular are prioritizing fulfilling energy needs and engagement with Gulf states. And this has been to the detriment of rights promotion in the region. Moreover, other Western actors, from global management consultancies to celebrities, athletes, and influencers, are at the forefront of whitewashing human rights abuse of autocratic governments in exchange for exorbitant payouts. Governments in the region are attacking civil society and free speech, and dissidents are paying an increasingly high price for their legitimate dissent. In many MENA countries in 2022, including in Iran and Tunisia, people took to the streets to protest rights abuse and were met with abusive law enforcement and detention responses. In these and other countries like Egypt, security forces continue to enjoy complete impunity for abuse. In Saudi Arabia, authorities conducted arrests of peaceful dissidents, public intellectuals, and human rights activists, and sentenced people to decades-long prison terms just for posting on social media. Dozens of human rights defenders continue to languish in detention. In Tunisia, the president, Kais Saied, took steps to dismantle the country's democratic foundations so that he could consolidate power. Activists, journalists, and others who have criticized these abusive steps have been subjected to restrictive measures, including arbitrary house arrests, travel bans, and even criminal prosecution. In 2022, Morocco also stepped up their harassment of activists and critics, and they've continued to detain and subject them to unfair trials. Authorities have also obstructed the work of Western Saharan human rights groups, including by blocking their legal registration. In Israel, security forces raided the offices of 7 prominent Palestinian civil society organizations and issued closure orders against them. This followed their decision in 2021 to outlaw 6 of the groups. Palestinian civil society today faces nothing short of an existential threat, with the fate of human rights advocacy in Israel and Palestine hanging in the balance. Civic space in Jordan has also shrunk, as authorities persecute and harass citizens organizing peacefully and engaging in political dissent using vague and abusive laws that criminalize speech, association, and assembly. In Algeria, too, 250 to 300 Algerians are in detention for exercising their rights to free expression and assembly. A third of these are in pre-trial detention. Governments like the UAE are also using new tools, including surveillance technologies, to undermine free expression and stamp out dissent. And this year, abusive practices have been coupled with a chilling rise in executions. As of June, 26 people were on death row in Bahrain following unfair convictions. In November, Kuwait executed 7 people after an over 5-year moratorium. And in March, Saudi authorities executed 81 men, the largest mass execution in decades, despite their promises to curtail its use of the death penalty. Iran has also just recently executed 4 protesters, and they seem to be readying to execute even more. As human rights conditions in the region have deteriorated, many prominent activists have been forced into exile. But MENA governments have shown the appetite and ability to go beyond their borders to threaten and target dissidents. This is with surveillance, harassment, intimidation, abduction, and even assassination of those who are abroad. At the same time, economic conditions in many countries in the region have significantly deteriorated, with larger numbers of people no longer able to access quality food, water, electricity, healthcare, decent housing and education, and governments, often entrenched in corruption and suffering from weak judicial institutions, are failing to implement the necessary reforms and rights-respecting social protection schemes to support them. In Lebanon, decades of corruption and mismanagement of the electricity sector have led to that sector unraveling, with the state unable to provide more than 3 hours of electricity per day. The lack of electricity has impacted every aspect of residents' lives here, including the ability to store and cook food, access education and work opportunities, power medical and assistive devices, and enjoy a decent standard of living. In addition, as a result of weak judicial institutions, no one has been held accountable for the catastrophic explosion in Beirut's port on August 4, 2020, which killed at least 219 people. Lebanese leaders have continued to obstruct and delay the ongoing domestic investigation, shielding high-level officials from accountability. In September, a daily cholera outbreak also spread across northern Syria, leading to deaths and fears that it may spread to the rest of the country and the region more broadly. According to the Global Report on Food Crises in 2022, 9 countries or territories in MENA suffer from high-severity food insecurity. MENA is also the most water-scarce region in the world, which only exacerbates food shortages. The International Water Management Institute has warned that climate change will only increase water stress. Iraq is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to global warming and climate change. As a major oil producer, the country's own oil outputs are directly implicated in these conditions. Recent reporting suggests that the flaring of natural gas in the oil production process in Iraq is correlated with worsening environmental conditions and worsening health conditions of Iraqis living in oil-producing provinces. Governments at the UN Climate Change Conference in Egypt in 2022 concluded a historic deal to pay poor nations for damage from climate change. But that agreement didn't include urgent action to phase out fossil fuels, cut emissions, or improve climate targets. One of the main ways to incentivize governments to deliver more ambitious climate policies is through public pressure. But during the summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, climate activists were subjected to intimidation, harassment, and surveillance. As we look toward the upcoming climate conference in the UAE, concerns around civil society participation and freedom of expression are paramount. As ever, marginalized communities, including LGBT individuals, refugees and migrants, and stateless individuals, have often been among the most susceptible to the negative trends we documented in 2022, while women in MENA continue to experience systematic discrimination in both private and public spheres. While there was some progress in improving rights protections, including the positive rescission of a penal code provision in Kuwait used against transgender people, and modest labor reforms in the Gulf, systemic repression continues to be the norm. While Qatari authorities introduced several promising migrant labor reforms in the lead up to the World Cup in 2022, their benefits were limited because they were introduced too late, were poorly enforced, or were narrow in scope. Despite working in Qatar's extreme heat to build the World Cup infrastructure and their indispensable role in delivering the tournament, many migrant workers were victims of grave abuse, and Qatari authorities and FIFA have yet to fulfill their human rights obligations and responsibilities by compensating these victims who made the tournament possible. Civilians in MENA also continue to suffer the consequences of conflict-related abuses in 2022. Despite ceasefires in Syria and Yemen, civilians in both countries were subjected to unlawful attacks that maimed and killed. Amid these ongoing hostilities, civilians also continue to be impacted by crumbling economies and decimated healthcare systems and social services infrastructures, impacting their ability to realize their most basic rights. Gaza also witnessed another round of hostilities in August, triggered by airstrikes launched by Israeli forces that resulted in the killing of 49 Palestinians and the injuring of several hundred Israelis, largely as a result of indiscriminate rocket fire by armed Palestinian groups. Despite a breakthrough in 2022 in a Syria crimes against humanity prosecution in Germany against 2 former Syrian intelligence officials, conflicts in the region continued to be characterized by impunity for war crimes. Libya is no exception, where currently an accountability-free zone has emboldened militias to commit violations and abuses with impunity. Impunity and unexploded ordnance, like landmines, cluster munitions, and other improvised explosive devices, remain as deadly legacies of current and past conflicts in the region. As a human rights advocate and person from and in the region, these worsening dynamics bring into laser focus the importance, on the one hand, of continued human rights advocacy, as well as the urgent need to adapt our human rights toolkit and broaden our circle of activists and allies. In every country in the region today, we see human rights crises unfolding. For every abuse we document, there is an impacted person, family, and community that is affected. The challenges we face are systemic, and the threats are existential. Protecting and strengthening human rights in the global human rights system in the face of predictable efforts by abusive leaders to tear them down demands renewed commitments by us all. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you very much, Lama, for this really great overview. We will move to our second panelist, Adam Kugel, who is a Deputy Director of the Middle East and North Africa Division. Adam will speak on socioeconomic rights trends of the past year with a specific focus on Jordan and Lebanon. Take it away, Adam.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to give a short overview on the situation with socioeconomic rights in the region. I think my colleague Lama in her presentation just now really laid out very well a lot of the challenges that the region is facing. We have made socioeconomic work a strategic priority because really the state of the region demands it. I would say outside the Gulf, nearly every country in the region is suffering from some sort of major economic challenge that impacts directly socioeconomic rights. Just to name a few very clear examples that I think most people probably already know about. In Lebanon and Syria, for example, fuel shortages, both are suffering from severe fuel shortages caused by economic crisis. In particular, in Lebanon, the fuel shortages have played a major role in the collapse of the electricity sector that hasn't dramatically improved in the last few years and is leaving Lebanese with no more than around 2 hours of state electricity per day on average. In Jordan, we've seen economic challenges lead to protests recently over high fuel prices, some of which actually turned violent and led to unfortunately a few cases of deaths of policemen and other violence and rioting. In Egypt, you see the same dynamic where the economic slide and the currency devaluation has really put a lot of pressure on the Sisi government. And it's really, I think, what is the main driver between the first cracks we're seeing in the authoritarian regime now, where he's been forced to make some limited concessions, such as the release of some prisoners, as well as the calling of a national dialogue. Now, we don't believe that any of these are major steps forward, but I think that they are an indication that the government there feels pressure, and it's the economic challenges and the socioeconomic rights deficits that we think are playing a major role in causing these dynamics. So, people across the region are clearly suffering. Their major socioeconomic rights are not being met. People are having trouble accessing quality food, water, electricity, adequate healthcare, decent housing, and education. All of these are really deteriorating in countries across the region. I think an important thing to note about socioeconomic rights is, when there are deficits, these can have cascading effects that, like in the case of Jordan, lead to instability and impact on other civil and political rights as well, as authorities tighten the screws and try to tamp out, unrest that is motivated by the deficits in socioeconomic rights. So, what do governments need to do to address this situation? We believe that what governments need to do is center socioeconomic rights as fundamental human rights, not as merely luxuries, but rights that they must fulfill. And the main tool that governments should use to do that is social protection policies. Strong social protection policies, they're really one of the most powerful tools for governments that they can use to reduce poverty and inequality. And they play a critical role in realizing the human right to social security and other human rights. They are an essential pillar of redistributivist policies when they put money that has been gathered through progressive taxation into the hands of those who have less. So social protection, what is it? It has no agreed on legal definition. When we say it, what we mean is a broad range of policies and programs, such as things like school meals, social housing, pensions, parental benefits, government help connecting individuals and families with healthcare, nutritious food, housing, and other kinds of programs. These programs are premised on the idea that no matter what circumstances a person is born into, they deserve a fair chance in life and protection at all stages of their life to an adequate standard of living. These programs can take different forms, including direct cash transfers. That's probably the most easy and obvious one, but also in-kind support, such as providing food, providing housing credits, things like that. Notably, I think an important point to mention here is that social protection policies, they should not be defined as an emergency response to a situation or a crisis, or as a charity. Rather, they are a set of permanent entitlements that are prescribed by domestic legislation defining individuals as rights holders, and guaranteeing them access to independent claims mechanisms if they are denied benefits for which they qualify. We believe that social protection should be universal and available to everyone. And what we've seen throughout the region are governments like Lebanon and Jordan implement bifurcated systems that are piecemeal, whereby there is a social security administration or agency that covers people who are in the formal economy, and then there are direct assistance programs that are targeting the most vulnerable. But Human Rights Watch research has discovered that between those different programs, they really are covering just tiny bits of the population and leaving many people, the vast majority of the population, with no benefits whatsoever. HRW conducted a survey in Lebanon of around 1,200 households to gather information about people's economic conditions and their ability to afford food, medicines, housing, and other basic necessities. And we found some really stark findings. 70% of households had difficulties making ends meet or were always behind on basic expenses. For households with children, over a third said they were having difficulty paying for school meals. In more than 1 out of 4 households, an adult had to skip a meal because there wasn't enough money or other resources to get food. And when we asked how many people were receiving any type of assistance from the government, we discovered that of our survey household data, less than 5% of people were receiving anything. I mean, I think that gives you a sense of how the Lebanese government, in this case, and governments across the region in particular, are not, broadly speaking, meeting the socioeconomic needs of their citizens, and people are being left behind. Just very quickly on the case of Jordan, the authorities here have a similar bifurcated system where there's a social security administration that covers people in the formal sector, but this does not include the vast majority or a large percentage, I should say, of workers that work in the informal sector. And direct targeted assistance programs use advanced algorithms to determine eligibility, and they often exclude people who should otherwise qualify. Governments, these targeted programs can be, one of the solutions in addressing the major challenges that people are facing, but they shouldn't be the only strategy. And governments need to come up with comprehensive social protection programs and plans that progressively move towards meeting all of the socioeconomic rights of citizens in their respective countries. And I know probably the first thing somebody would say is, how can governments answer the call when they're all suffering economic crises, and how can they find the resources for this? Well, just to give an example, in Lebanon, the World Bank estimated, or excuse me, not the World Bank, the United Nations estimated in 2020 that if Lebanon taxed the wealthiest 10% at a rate of 0.9%, that would alleviate extreme poverty in the country. If they taxed the most wealthy 10% at 3.6%, that would alleviate moderate poverty throughout the country. So with progressive tax systems and centering these important issues as fundamental human rights, countries should move towards ensuring that their citizens are not left behind and that their fundamental needs are met. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Adam. I guess there's still a lot of issues to discuss on these, social protection plans that you discussed, but maybe some questions will come up in the Q&A later. Let's move now to a slightly different topic. Our third panelist is Rathna Begum. Rathna is a senior researcher in the Women's Rights Division, who will cover from the revolt of Iranian women to the fight of domestic workers in the Gulf. Go ahead, Rathna.
Thank you, Hanan, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. So as many of you know, the protest in Iran has continued unabated since September, when 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman Mahsa Jina Amini died following her arrest by the morality police for the breach of Iran's strict dress code. Now, this uprising has been different, with men and women of various ethnic backgrounds marching under the banner of women's rights, of women, life, freedom, understanding that freedom for women means freedom for all. Now, the protesters' demands are for fundamental change, The dress code is the most visible form of discrimination, impacting women and girls' right to take part in all aspects of public life, including studying, working, and even leaving their home. Yet it is just one aspect of the systemic discrimination that they face. Women in Iran have double the unemployment rate than men, as policies restrict the professions that they can enter into, and employers can routinely discriminate against them when hiring. Since the passing of the November 2021 population law, women are now contending with severe limitations on their access to sexual and reproductive rights, including bans on sterilizations, restrictions on access to free contraception, and further limits on their access to safe abortion. Child marriage is on the increase, with policies encouraging couples to marry earlier, and laws that grant husbands huge control over women's lives, including where they can live, work, and even travel abroad. Now, the authorities have still not passed a domestic violence law, despite increasing reports of horrific femicides and women risking their lives to escape abuse. The authorities have been brutally cracking down on those protesting such repression, with mass arrests, torture and other ill treatment, and excessive and lethal force that have killed hundreds. Human Rights Watch has also documented some cases of sexual harassment and assault of women and girls during arrest and detention following protests. Now, in 2022, we also saw women across the region take to social media and to the streets to protest the continued spate of heinous killings of women and girls by men, including in broad daylight. For instance, in June, in Egypt, a male student stabbed to death Naira Ashraf, a female fellow student, in front of Mansoura University when she refused his marriage proposal. Days later, in Jordan, in what was seen as a copycat move, Iman Irshad, a 21-year-old student, was killed after being shot 5 times by an older man at her university campus in Amman. Now, such femicides are the tip of the iceberg of the much wider spate of violence that women and girls face. Women have protested the lethal cost of male entitlement over women's lives and choices brought about by the discriminatory laws and policies against women and the authorities' failure to prevent violence against women and protect survivors. Half the countries in the Middle East and North Africa region still have no laws on violence against women to prevent the violence, protect survivors, and prosecute abusers. Egypt, for instance, has no such law, yet sexual and gender-based violence remains pervasive. In November 2022, Human Rights Watch issued a report finding that refugees and asylum seekers, particularly Black Africans, live in vulnerable communities that expose them to sexual assault and rape. But the authorities are failing to provide them protection, and police are refusing to register survivors' complaints, pursue investigations, or even refer them to forensic or healthcare services. Even in the 10 countries that have passed laws on violence against women, many are either weak, lack funding to resource measures, or have not been implemented well or at all. In December, we issued a report on Tunisia, where 5 years since the passing of Law 58, one of the most progressive laws on violence against women in the region, the authorities are still failing to prevent domestic violence, protect survivors, and prosecute their abusers. Women told us that the police did not explain their rights and options, dismiss their complaints, or press them to reconcile with their abusers rather than pursue criminal complaints. And inadequate access to emergency shelters means that women who need to flee abuse have nowhere to go. Women are exposed to such violence in the first place because of the discriminatory laws and practices across the MENA region. Many personal status laws discriminate against women in matters of marriage, divorce, decisions relating to children, and inheritance. And these measures trap women into abusive marriages and families. Male guardianship policies, moreover, provides men with control over women's lives that enables domestic violence while denying women their legal autonomy and rights. In 2022, even with the scrutiny from the World Cup, women in Qatar continue to report being denied their rights and freedoms through enforced state discrimination. Human Rights Watch's 2021 report found that women needed male guardian permission in order to travel abroad until certain ages, study on government scholarships, work in many government jobs, and access some forms of reproductive health care. In Saudi Arabia, where there's been some reforms in recent years, the authorities continue to implement a male guardianship system. And in March 2022, the Saudi lawmakers codified male guardianship and other discriminatory provisions into the law when they passed the country's first written personal status law. The law now requires women to have their male guardian's permission in order to marry, and once married, have to obey their husband in a reasonable manner. Women have limited grounds to apply for a judicial divorce, while men have unilateral right to divorce, and men remain the default guardians of their children, even when women are granted primary child custody. Finally, migrant domestic workers remain among the most exposed to abuse and violence in the Middle East, as they are denied equal labor protections like other workers, and their legal status is tied to their employer under the abusive kafala sponsorship system. They continue to report wage theft, long working hours without a day off, passport confiscations, forced confinement, isolation, physical and sexual abuse. 2022 has been a year of women fighting for their rights, from their choice of dress to step out of their home to the right to life. Authorities in the region must heed such calls, or we will continue to witness the brutal, lethal cost on their lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rathna, for this overview. I think we will move to our last panelist before taking questions. And another kind reminder, if you have any questions, if there's anything you would like to know in a bit more detail or any other question that you have, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. There's a button that says Q&A. You can just type in your question and we will see it. Our final panelist is Nadia Hardman. She's a researcher in the Refugees' Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, and she will talk about the EU externalization of border management in the Mediterranean and the need for legal and safe pathways. Please go ahead, Nadia.
Thanks very much, Hanan, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. So the Middle East and North Africa is a source, transit, and destination region for refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. Conditions for displaced people continued in 2022 to be dire for many in the region, forcing thousands to try and access international protection, safety, and better opportunities in Europe and elsewhere. During 2022, Egyptian authorities and security forces subjected refugees and asylum seekers to arbitrary detention, physical abuse, and refoulement, forced returns to a country where individuals may face threats to their lives or freedom, torture, or other serious harm. Algerian authorities continued arbitrary and collective expulsions to Niger and Mali of migrants of multiple nationalities, including kids, often without individual screenings or due process. In June 2022, at least 23 African men died at the Spain-Morocco border in Melilla. The incident occurred as thousands of migrants and asylum seekers from multiple countries, including from Sudan, South Sudan, and Chad, attempted to enter by climbing the high chain link fence surrounding Melilla, one of two Spanish enclaves in North Africa. Videos and photographs from the incident show Moroccan security forces using excessive force, including beatings, and Spanish Guardia Civil launching tear gas at men clinging to the fences. In late 2022, communications from several UN experts to the Saudi government and Houthi forces, the de facto authority in much of Yemen, laid out a series of grave allegations of abuse against mostly Ethiopian migrants and asylum seekers who transit in their thousands through Yemen in order to access work opportunities in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. The abuses included killings, torture, arbitrary detention, and sexual abuse. The UN experts alleged the killing of approximately 430 migrants and injuring 650 others in cross-border shelling and shooting between January and April 2022. In Lebanon, where nearly 1.5 million Syrian refugees live mostly without legal status, authorities made plans to return refugees, even though Syrians who face grave abuses and persecution at the hands of the Syrian government and affiliated militias when they return. It is estimated that the vast majority of Syrian refugees live in extreme poverty in Lebanon. 2022 saw a continuation of the EU's externalization practices, preventing migrants and asylum seekers in the Middle East and North Africa from accessing Europe. Externalization describes extraterritorial state actions to prevent migrants, including refugees and asylum seekers, from entering the territories of destination countries. Actions can include direct interdictions, such as pushbacks at border or at sea, and preventive policies, as well as more indirect actions, such as the provision of financial support for or assistance to security or migration management in and by third countries. The central Mediterranean route continued to be deadly in 2022, and a prime example of this EU externalization practice. IOM recorded 1,295 people dead and missing along the central Mediterranean in 2022 as of October 25th, adding to the horrifying tally of almost 25,000 deaths since 2014. The EU has abdicated its responsibility to ensure search and rescue in the Mediterranean. No EU ships actively patrol anywhere near where most boats enter into distress. Frontex, the EU's border and coast guard, conducts aerial surveillance in service of interceptions and returns, not rescues. In December 2022, Human Rights Watch showed how the flight path of a drone operated by Frontex assisted in the interceptions of a refugee and migrant boats by Libyan forces. Frontex aerial surveillance now forms a central plank of the EU's strategy to prevent asylum seekers from reaching Europe by boat and to knowingly return them to the horrific detention and abuse of migrants in Libya. In July 2022, the UN fact-finding mission to Libya found that migrants and refugees are exposed to the risk of crimes against humanity. An increasing number of people, mostly Syrians and Lebanese, are taking to the sea from Lebanon by boat, trying to reach Cyprus or Italy. In September 2022, at least 77 migrants aboard a boat sailing from Lebanon died after the ship sank off the coast of Syria. In November 2022, Human Rights Watch published research which documented how Turkish authorities arbitrarily arrested, detained, and deported hundreds of Syrian refugee men and boys to Syria in 2022. Deported Syrians told Human Rights Watch that Turkish officials arrested them in their homes, workplaces, and on the street, detained them in poor conditions, beat and abused most of them, forced them to sign voluntary return forms, and drove them to the border crossing point with northern Syria and forced them to cross at gunpoint. This research demonstrates that Turkey is not safe for refugees, and Human Rights Watch has called on the EU to clarify this position. In view of all these horrifying abuses against migrants in the MENA region, Human Rights Watch calls on destination countries to increase legal migration pathways instead of focusing on deterrence-based migration controls. For example, through resettlement opportunities, sponsorship programs, humanitarian visas, higher education programs, family reunification schemes, and increased labor mobility. They should prioritize saving lives, uphold their international protection obligations, remove migration control conditionality from development aid, ensure that all migration control funding, programs, cooperation agreements, or policies comply with human rights standards, and increase support for locally designed projects addressing the root causes of irregular migration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for your very informative overview. I would like to thank our panelists and would like to open the floor for any questions that you have. A kind reminder to please use the question and answer function in Zoom, where you can post your questions. We do have a little bit of time, so I want to start with a question to Lama. Lama, you have painted quite, in your presentation on the trends that you mentioned in the region, you painted quite a dark picture of 2022 and what it brought with it. Also, in addition to everything, the Ukraine war started, which also impacted the Middle East region and North Africa in many ways. But there were some bright spots as well. You mentioned the prosecution of people accused of war crimes in Germany, which is something that Human Rights Watch has been pushing for a long time in many different contexts. And this, brings me to speak about the importance of accountability and how this one event, in a way also gives us hope. Can you speak more to accountability, to the many different situations that are currently meant to be under prosecution? For example, the International Criminal Court has open investigations in Israel, Palestine, in Libya, but we haven't seen a lot of movement yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanan. I think there's no way to sugarcoat the reality of the rights abuse in the region, and I think that probably comes out clearly in the presentation. One thing I would like to add, though, regarding that is one thing that gives me hope is that we continue to see that people are willing to organize themselves and stand up and demand their rights from their governments. And as long as we have that, there is hope for greater rights protection in the region. And our role at Human Rights Watch is to stand in solidarity with those local movements and to demand protection for them and for their rights. In terms of accountability, we have an accountability deficit in the region. We see an absence of rule of law in nearly every country within the Middle East and North Africa. And this has detrimental impacts on the full range of rights that we discussed today, from the socioeconomic to the civil political. And in the context of armed conflict, we see that this has particularly devastating consequences, because it does give security forces impunity to continue to pursue what are very lethal abusive practices. As an international community, we do have tools at our disposal, but unfortunately we have seen that multilateral institutions have not stood up in defense of rights for people across the globe in equal ways. So it is not lost on anyone the difference in the reaction, for example, to the Ukraine crisis and the investments there by the International Criminal Court versus some of the conflicts in the region, including where the ICC has been involved, for example, in Libya. So I think we do need to demand more of the institutions that are, in place and that are engaged. At the same time, we need to, as I mentioned again in my presentation, expand our toolkit. And here, this is where we see the advancements in universal jurisdiction as really important, and the pursuing of perpetrators of crimes against humanity and war crimes, wherever they may be, as critical to advancing the rule of law and to protect civilians.
Thank you very much for that, Lama. I think that we have been working on expanding and trying to highlight issues around this expanded toolkit. So I think we'll see what this year brings with it. Adam, you spoke about, in your presentation, you were speaking about the comprehensive social protection plans that are needed in order to accommodate these changes. And you started to talk about a little bit about the research that Human Rights Watch has done. Could you please expand a little bit more and give us a little bit more information of what we have already done on this front?
Yeah, so the way that we have approached this in several countries, but most notably till now in Jordan and in Lebanon, is to first map out what the social protection environment looks like. So in Lebanon, we supplemented that with a survey of over 1,200 households in which we in collaboration with a survey firm asked them questions about their situation and how they're managing. And basically we're able to get some baseline data about the challenges people are facing. And so in my presentation, I read off some of the major findings, which are, over 70% of people and households having difficulty making ends meet, one adult in one household going without food because of the challenges. And then of course, the major component of that was in terms of social protection was asking, what kinds of government benefits are you receiving? And what we found is it was almost, not less than 5% of the 1,200 households. Now, if you then, you ask why, and you look at what does exist, and you can see that in these countries, there is a social security administration that does pay out some benefits for workers working in the formal economy, whether it be unemployment benefits or other benefits. Sometimes those are available. In Lebanon, that's the case. But unfortunately, in Lebanon, over 60% of people work outside of the informal economy. So because of that, they're completely uncovered. And if you look at, there have been 2 targeted social protection programs that Lebanon has set up in collaboration with the World Bank in recent years to target what they view as the most vulnerable people. But these are covering really minimum amounts of people. I mean, I think each program covers less than 3.5% of the population. So in between, workers who can get some benefits from the Social Security Agency and those who are able to somehow, manage to qualify for one of these targeted programs, in between them is a massive amount of people that are receiving virtually nothing from the state in terms of, guaranteeing their major socioeconomic rights. We saw the same thing essentially in Jordan in our research, which is still in process and will be published later this year. I think the major component of what we looked at in Jordan, however, was the algorithm that's being used by the targeted assistance program that's meant to target the most vulnerable, and how that algorithm is being implemented. And we found, I think we interviewed several dozen people, many of whom who couldn't get access to it. And the major issues were, number one, the way in which the questionnaire is distributed to determine one's eligibility requires people to essentially, state, onerous amounts of information. And it also forces them to match their expenditures, their household expenditures with their household incomes, which a lot of people aren't able to do. And it also sort of arbitrarily excludes people. For example, we found that one of the stipulations was if you have a car at all, you don't qualify. These programs just aren't covering necessarily the people they're meant to cover, and they're not covering enough of the population. So you just have large numbers of people who are excluded, some of them arbitrarily. So that's what our research has found, and we're going to continue to use that research to encourage governments, whether it be Lebanon or Jordan or other governments in the region, to create comprehensive strategies to ensure that nobody is left behind. Everybody has a basic threshold met in terms of their socioeconomic rights.
Thank you very much, Adam, for explaining all that. There is a next question to Rathna. Rathna, you discussed labor rights. You discussed how the kafala system can really be like a very oppressive system. There have been some labor reforms that the Gulf cooperation countries have said they would implement, promised to implement, or have theoretically implemented. How do we feel about that? Do we think that these go far enough? Do we think that these actually give the adequate protections that migrant laborers need, or do we think that they're lacking? Could you please speak a little bit more on these issues?
Sure. So there are 2 things, I think, just to reflect, because I talked a little bit about both the lack of labor protections for migrant domestic workers and the reforms around the kafala system and how that traps migrant domestic workers. So just on the first front, when we talk about labor protections for migrant domestic workers, we started with the fact that migrant domestic workers didn't have worker rights. They just didn't exist under labor laws for many of the countries in the Middle East. But over the years, and within 5 years, in fact, we had 5 countries in the Gulf who passed laws on domestic workers. Jordan also passed a law that allowed domestic workers to be incorporated into their labor law. But we still have Lebanon and Oman, who are major destination countries for migrant domestic workers, that still exclude domestic workers from the labor law. So they don't have the basic rights to things like a day off, to limits on their working hours and so on. Then there's the issue of the kafala system, which essentially traps, and the fact that their legal status is tied to their employer means that they have to, in terms of entering the country, residing in the country, to get a residency visa, that is all tied up by the employer. The employer gets to decide all of that. And then the employer can decide whether they can even leave them, to change jobs or to even leave the country. All of that is under the employer's permission. And that's what kafala, or the sponsorship system, is really all about. And over the years, after a huge amount of work, by human rights organizations and trade unions to really talk and document the impacts of the kafala system, we've started to see governments, particularly in the Gulf region, start to sort of tinker with the system and start to sort of see if they can tease out elements. Over the years, you will have heard governments talk about how they've abolished kafala, that it's all gone. But the truth is that kafala still remains. And the most significant reforms really happened in Qatar after, they committed to the International Labour Organization and the wider world that they would reform the kafala system. But what we saw happen was in 2020, they made a significant reform, which means that now migrant workers, including domestic workers, should be allowed to leave their employers and change jobs without employer permission, and even leave the country. They now have the right to leave the country without what was known as an exit permit that was normally provided by their employer. But those reforms happened only in 2020, so many people didn't benefit. The way they've even been implemented has been hugely problematic. So what we had before, where you needed your employer's permission to be able to change jobs, no longer exists, but you still have to apply to the government in order to say that you want to change from one employer to the next. And what we've seen in practice happening is that the authorities have been saying that they want to see that workers have resigned and that the resignation notices have been signed by their employers. In doing so, what they've done is by a de facto bringing back in the employer permission for to be able to leave their jobs in the first place. So the implementation even of that kafala reform, which was really crucial, has not actually been done very well. And migrant domestic workers are under a huge challenge because they live in their employers' homes. And Qatar has not abolished the absconding penalty. Absconding basically means that when a worker leaves them without their permission, they can simply report them for absconding. And migrant domestic workers who live in their employers' homes, that means literally escaping out of their employer's home. They can find themselves reported for absconding and arrested. And so this is the kafala reforms that we've seen in Qatar has not really benefited migrant domestic workers as of yet. Other countries that have made reforms, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have been quite limited. Yeah, so I'll stop there, but I would say, we've seen some crucial, important reforms happening over the years, and it's good to see those things start to break, but we haven't really seen a dismantling of kafala. And as a result, we're still seeing endemic and systemic reforms against migrant domestic workers. Thanks.
Thank you very much for clarifying these issues, Ratna. I think sometimes, with certain marketing of certain governmental statements, people tend to get the idea that a law has been passed and everything is fine and dandy. So it's really important to clarify how much more still needs to be done. I have one last question here for Nadia, who spoke about the deterrence-based migration controls that are currently in place, as you called them, Nadia, by the European Union, and that instead the destination countries, meaning mostly countries in the European Union, should increase legal migration, safe and legal migration pathways instead, as a safer option, obviously. Could you please explain how and why, how this would work and what it would change in this migration landscape?
Thanks, Hanan. I mean, it would work if the EU stood in solidarity with refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers instead of creating what is effectively a fortress. We have Fortress Europe, and there is a concerted effort to outsource migration management and control to neighboring refugee countries and to bankroll them, as is the case with Turkey. Instead of looking at responsibility sharing, burden sharing, acknowledging that the EU, as we've seen in the Ukraine refugee crisis, has the capacity to quickly implement a human rights-based approach to migration flows. And so because we have that as a precedent, you know, I think it's really incumbent upon the EU and its member states to look at what legal and safe pathways mean. And I mentioned some of them in my presentation, but really, you know, there is so much in the playbook. You know, we're talking about, of course, increases in resettlement spaces, visas, humanitarian visas, basically ways for people to access territory so they don't have to risk their life. And people will continue to risk their life. That is the cruel irony that comes from the idea that deterrence-based migration controls work. They do not. People will continue to risk their lives trying to access safety and a better life. You know, there is also a push now to try and criminalize irregular entry. And, you know, the Refugee Convention specifically prohibits the penalization of refugees for irregular entry. And that's just, you know, that's just the law. And what the EU has done is deflect, I think, the focus to, you know, trafficking and smuggling of migrants, and how really this is the root cause of every problem. It is a part of the situation, but it completely misses the fact that people are trying to get to a safer and more prosperous place so that they can eke out a better life. And, you know, look, we're talking about labor mobility, we're talking about visa schemes, we're talking about community sponsorship, we're talking about individual sponsorship, expanding family reunification schemes, looking at all sorts of different ways to show people that they can access, you know, their rights basically, and to avoid just the horrifying deaths that we have witnessed in 2022 and historically that will continue unless this is taken seriously. Thanks, Hanan.
Thank you very much, Nadia. I think that was very informative in terms of understanding what that could look like, what that could effectively look like when we talk about safe and legal pathways. With that, we have no more questions, and I would like to thank our panelists. I would like to thank everyone who attended today. I would also like to remind everyone who's online that you do have the possibility to consult all the different chapters for all the different countries that we cover worldwide. We cover around 100. So if you want to read through them, all you have to do is just go online on www.hrw.org. There you will have the different country chapters covering from Libya to Ukraine, whatever it is that you're interested in different languages. We hope that this was informative. And again, we thank you very much for joining us. And with this, we will wrap up the press conference. Thank you very much.